Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 3GNY Stories Live WEDU Wednesdays. My name is Shannon Sachs, and I'm a 3G board member, and I'm also the grandchild of two Holocaust survivors. I'm thrilled to be here tonight to host our 15th WEDU Wednesday. I want to welcome all our first-time viewers and welcome back those of you who regularly participate in our programs. We're so very grateful for our community of supporters. Tonight, we're featuring guest speaker Donna Aviv. She has a fascinating story to share with all of us. But before I hand the virtual floor over, I want to remind you of who we are and what our mission is. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for the grandchildren of survivors and our supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and the lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. 3GNY was founded in 2005 by a group of 6, and our membership now exceeds well over 4,500 people, and we're continuing to grow. Over the past 15 years, we've held diverse programs of all sizes around the New York area. 3GNY has also played a leading role in launching other 3G groups, including 3GDC and 3GNJ. And we're in conversations with others across the country to expand our reach even further. Tonight's WEDU Wednesday program showcases 3GNY's flagship educational initiative, WEDU, which is short for We Educate. This 4-week training program empowers grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and with community groups. 3GNY has trained over 300 speakers in New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. And once the pandemic hit and we were forced to go 100% virtual, we quickly became equipped to train all around the country via Zoom. In 2020 alone, we trained 62 grandchildren and more speakers than in any other year of 3GNY. Also in 2020, between speaking in schools, our live programming, and our YouTube channel, more than 10,000 people have heard our stories. In total, throughout WEDU's experience, more than 30,000 students have been impacted by our stories. Now, we've all seen the heartbreaking and quite scary studies detailing the lack of Holocaust knowledge among recent high school and college graduates. The good news is that students who do receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with people of different races and backgrounds. They're more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information and are more likely to be upstanders. Through our grandparents' testimony, we talk about the importance of stepping in early and often where small injustices are found, on the playground, in the classroom, and on the street, because that's the easiest and most efficient way to act. Hope is not lost, and we do need to keep doing more and keep pushing forward with the work we do. With that being said, you can help us accomplish our mission through a financial gift of any amount. Your kind donation will directly impact training more speakers and thus reaching even more students. Keep in mind that we don't solicit donations from schools, teachers, or students. We provide our programming to schools completely free of charge, and we aim to keep the cost of training our 3Gs as low as possible. If you go in our chat, there's a link of ways to donate, and we hope that you'll consider making a donation to our very important mission. If you've already donated, thank you, and consider doing it again. We really do appreciate it. I want to sincerely thank everyone out there tonight who came to join us. By you being here tonight, you're helping us honor the memories of our grandparents and ensuring that never again is more than just an empty phrase. That it's not more than just an empty phrase, excuse me. I'd like to now introduce Jonathan Jacobs, a 3GNY volunteer who has gone through our WEDU program. Jonathan, take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan, and I too am the grandchild of two Holocaust survivors. I became involved with WEDU and 3GNY in early 2020. The WEDU class was an incredible opportunity to learn how to tell my grandparents' survival stories, but it also provided me a forum to meet some incredible 3Gs, like tonight's speaker, Donna Aviv. Donna became a 3GNY speaker in 2020 to provide students with a more tangible picture of what happened during the Holocaust, in the hopes that they would apply history's lessons to instances of dictatorship and genocide still occurring today. She was committed to telling her family story while her grandmother is alive, so that Bubby Sara would know that children will learn from what her family suffered. Donna lives in Brooklyn with her husband and newborn son. She has a background in nonprofit work and currently manages a sales team for JustWorks, a professional employer organization supporting small businesses. As her former WEDU classmate, I've been fortunate to hear Donna speak numerous times, but tonight I'm very excited for you all to hear her storytelling. Donna, take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment so you all will be able to see the same slides that I share with students. One of the things that I found very helpful in these presentations is when with students, I can be a little bit interactive with them. So at a couple places, I'll sort of share with you the kinds of prompts that I give to the students to make sure that they're also sort of thinking about what they're seeing on the screen. So just one second while I share my screen. Right. Okay. So I want to start by showing you all a photograph of my grandmother. This is Sarah. I call her Bubby, which is the Yiddish word for grandmother. And this is a photo that was taken of her after World War II and after the Holocaust. And I saw this as I was growing up because my mom once gave it to her in a gift. And the caption for it was, to the woman who doesn't remember ever being young and beautiful. And this is sort of frozen in my mind because my grandmother doesn't remember being young because so much of her childhood was taken away from her because of the war. And there is one surviving photo from before the Holocaust of my grandmother. And this is actually her on the left. And this is generally where I'll ask kids if they can tell me what they see is happening in the photo. And so they'll say it looks like they're playing, it looks like it's summertime. I'll also ask them if they can tell maybe what age she is or the other girl is. They're probably around 10 years old in this photo. Depending on the class, maybe I can also use that as a reference point to their age. And then I go on to explain what we're seeing. So, there's some things we can see really clearly in this photo. So behind my grandmother on the left is her childhood home. And this is where she lived with her two brothers and her little sister. And her mother would have, would teach girls in the village to sew out of that home. And that little building just to the left is the barn. And my grandmother remembers that very clearly. And other than that, when I was growing up, there was a lot that I didn't know about this photo. It's kind of blurry. It's a little bit hard to see exactly what's happening. But my grandmother always talks about this as one of the happiest times in her life. And really, that all changed in 1939. And in 1939 was when the Germans invaded her village in Poland, and things progressively started to change. So there was a big sugar factory in my grandmother's village, and lots of Jews started being sent there, and prisoners of war were sent there, and there were more and more soldiers coming into her village. And then in 1942 was really when things changed, when her father was killed. And he was forced to dig a hole, and then he was shot and into that hole, and so that became his grave. And my grandmother found out about this from a neighbor who had seen it happen and who rushed over to the house to tell her. And when she heard the news, her mother wasn't home, and so she ran out into the road to go find her mother. And her mother was coming down the road and was crying and had already heard what had happened. And my grandmother was, of course, in tears just hearing that her father had been killed. And her mother said to her, Sarah, you're young, you'll grow up, you'll have a family of your own, but I'm going to be a widow for the rest of my life. And this calmed my grandmother. But when her mother said for the rest of her life, like that sounded like such a long time. And what they didn't know at the time is that just 4 weeks later, things would get even worse. 4 weeks later, all of the Jews in their village were all rounded up and marched out of the village. And my grandmother remembers carrying a little pack with, a few pieces of clothing and what they could quickly grab. And she remembers walking down the road in her village as they were walking out and seeing her friends who were not Jewish and were not being marched out of their village. And her friends from school, they turned away. And she didn't even not just get to say goodbye to her, but as she was being marched out, she was also being sort of shamed. And they marched for an entire day. And that was when they reached another town where there was a selection process that took place. And my grandmother and her mother and her little sister were sent to one line by a German soldier, and her two brothers were sent to another line. And she saw her two brothers, over in the other line, and her mother said to her, "Sarah, you have to go to the other line because your brother Sam is there, and who's going to cook for him if I'm not there and if you're not there?" And my grandmother did not want to leave. She didn't want to leave her mother or her little sister. And her mother sort of tore off that little backpack from her shoulders and pushed her towards the German soldier who was sorting people into lines. And my grandmother was terrified because, by breaking the rules in any form, you could be killed. And she said to the soldier, "Please, can I go over to the other line with my brothers?" And he sort of waved her off, which was very lucky for her. And she went and joined her brothers. And she turned back and she saw her little sister, Toby, crying and falling to the ground, sort of beating the ground, crying, "Sarah, don't leave me." And she was devastated by that, of course. And later she found out that her mother and her little sister had been sent to Sobibor, which was an extermination camp. So they had been killed. And meanwhile, my grandmother and her two brothers were sent to a labor camp, which was like a sort of farm where they were working. And there was talk about escaping and going into hiding. And so my grandmother was able to escape the labor camp fairly soon. And that was along with a couple other people. There was a gentleman named Harry, who they'd known before the war, and also a man named Velvel. And from that point, they went into hiding. And so it was extremely dangerous, of course, what they were doing to sort of bend and any of the expectations for them. And they hid anywhere that they could. So they would go from barn to barn and they would hide in haystacks. My grandmother remembers once having a dream where her father came to her and said, "Tomorrow soldiers are going to come and they're going to come looking for you in this barn, but don't leave, stay where you are because you're going to be okay." And my grandmother remembers waking up from that dream, and just as she was sharing it with the people she was hiding with, they could hear soldiers approaching. And sure enough, the soldiers came. They had a dog along with them, and somehow they didn't find them. So from barn to barn, they would go. At one point, they hid in a large haystack in the middle of a field. And, they were always in fear for their lives because anything that they would do to try and find food to even exist was putting them at risk. And in the haystack, there was a cow that came over at one point, sort of shifted the hay over and left a big hole, revealing where they were. And some of the neighborhood or the village children found them and started throwing rocks in that hole and telling them, singing for them to come out. And they continued hiding there. And again, somehow by just sheer luck, nobody found them. And it was finally once they had found a new hiding spot. They had dug a ditch, and this was in the middle of the winter. And they dug this deep hole in the ground, and they would hide there all day, sort of scrunched inside. And they would cover it up with snow and with twigs so that no one could see where they were. And there was one point where a local person from the village accidentally fell into that hole, and they realized at that point there was now someone who knew where they were, and this man begged them not to kill him, because he was very scared. He knew that he had found their secret as well, and they let him go. But at that point, they were terrified because now somebody knew where they had been hiding. And so Harry, who they had known before the war, and my grandmother's brother Sam, they went out to try and find another hiding place while my grandmother stayed in the ditch. And she always said that if she survived the war, she would never forgive them for leaving her, because she was terrified that that man who they had let leave would reveal their hiding place. And what Harry found ended up being the place where they would stay for quite some time. And this was where he was able to use some of his skills before the war as a tailor in exchange for being hidden. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that actually meant. And here's where I'll show this picture. This is not a photo of my family, but it's a photo that helps kids understand what religious Jews looked like in that time, in terms of how they dressed versus just the either secular or non-Jewish people who were living in Poland. And I'll ask the kids what differences they see between the way that the gentlemen in front are dressed and this man in the back, or the man in that gray hat, are dressed. And the kids will point out things like, oh, their coats are dark, or they're very long. And really, what happened was that when Jews were marched out of the villages, they had to leave all of their belongings behind. And then those belongings were sort of raided by the people who were not Jewish and were allowed to stay in their homes. But because the styles were so different, someone wouldn't just put on the coat of a religious Jew if that was not the sort of fashion. And so so Harry was able to sort of make an exchange, where in exchange for using his tailoring skills to take these long coats and this typically Jewish clothing, and to tailor it so that it would look more like the modern suits that others were wearing, he was given shelter. And he asked, when he got to this house, if his girlfriend Sarah could join him. And the woman who hosted them and who hid them, her name was Rybakova. And this is a photo of her. And she maybe looks like, a very serious woman, but she was very kind. And it's thanks to her that both my grandparents were able to survive. And she had sons who lived in the house, and they were little boys, and they really resented hiding Jews in their attic or in their home. But she just believed it was important to, care for them and to make sure that they survived. And so she would, help share some of the food. There's a story of when my grandmother got lice, and she made this special balm in order to help take out and kill all the lice that my grandmother had. And so she was really to thank for them surviving. And it was when they were at Rybakova's house that they heard about the liberation of Poland. And so after that, they decided to go back to my grandmother's village. And that was where they were also reunited with other family members. And my grandmother was so excited to go back to her home. But stories came back to them of other people who had survived, who they knew, including this man Velville, who they had hidden in barns with. And the story came back to them that he too had gone back to his village and to his home. And when he went back to his home, there were non-Jews living there who had taken over his house while him and his family had been pushed out. And they cut his throat when he tried to come back. And so it was very clear that it was still very dangerous. And even though it was technically my grandmother's family home, that it was too dangerous to stay. And so they, made their way out of Poland. But even after the war, they, were escaping pogroms, meaning mass executions of Jews that were still happening in some of the villages. And they made their way to a displaced persons camp in Germany, where they got married. And after some time of saving money, they saved enough to come to the US. And they came to New York, and they found an apartment in Coney Island. And for 9 years, they lived in that apartment, which was one room with 8 people. And it was my grandmother and my grandfather, my mother and my aunt, along with my grandmother's 2 surviving brothers. My grandfather had 5 brothers, and only one of them had survived. The other 4 had perished, along with his sister, who had also been killed in the war. And so it was a very difficult time, but they built their life in New York. And my grandmother is still alive. She's 97 years old. And I still look at this photo with her, and she's someone who really talks about survival and valuing life to this day. And she, she's someone who I am very, very close to. And a couple years ago, I really wanted to give her a gift. And, I thought back to, like, what is something that you can give to someone who you care so much about? But, she's one of these people who's very hard to give a gift to, because she's lost so much. There's no sort of material thing you can give that, really changes her world. And so I wanted to give her the gift of, this special moment that she remembers. And so I took that photograph and I painted it. And a couple years ago, I brought it to her, and she looked at it, and she immediately saw herself, and she saw her house, and she saw the barn, and she started telling me, all about what she was seeing. And I actually asked her if she remembered the name of the girl on the right in the photo. And I kind of assumed, like, maybe probably she wouldn't. And she said, yeah, that was Donna. And I said, no, she was 95 when I gave her the gift. And I said, like, maybe she's a little confused, and because I'm giving it to her, and so she thinks it's, and I said, no, who's the girl in the photo? She says, yeah, that was Donna. That was Danushka. She was the daughter of the principal, and she lived down the road. And so I had spent a couple months making this gift for her, and I had no idea that the person in the photo actually shared my name, which was very special. And my grandmother, thank God, is still alive. And she is, she lives in Israel now, and she is keeping safe like the best of us. When she talks about coronavirus, she still talks about how she's a survivor, and she won't let anything get her down, and she's very serious about it. And she's, a real testament to, not just surviving, but really thriving and telling her story and the significance of it. But it, of course, lives with her every day. Whenever I talk to her about her story, she still remembers leaving her little sister behind like it happened yesterday. But she's the smartest person I know, and probably the strongest person I know. And thank you all for listening to her story.
Donna, thank you so much for gifting us with your family story. It was really sweet, and I'm sure everyone out there, including myself, enjoyed it thoroughly. We're now going to open up question and answers for Donna. If you have a question, just put it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And due to the high volume of questions we typically get, we won't be able to answer all of them. But if you have a question that's not addressed tonight, feel free to email us at info@3gnewyork.org, and we'll relay it to Donna and she'll get back to you. Thanks for understanding. My first question, where was your grandma's village? What was the, closest big town to it? Where was it located? And a two-part question: have you been to Poland? Have you been to where your grandma's from?
So it's, interesting. So one of the things that I've gotten used to doing when I share this with students is actually not mentioning the names of the villages, just because it's probably a lot for kids who are not used to hearing Polish. So my grandmother was from Stryżew, which was sort of in southeastern Poland. And the largest town nearby was Lodz. And, there's some pieces actually of her story that when she shared them, I've spent time kind of looking at a map to figure out exactly how she got from place to place, like how she got from her village to where the selection happened. That was in a place called Próbieszów. And it's very hard for me to fully fathom it. And I think there are probably some pieces of it that are sort of lost in the telling from when my grandmother shared it, just because it's hard to sort of remember the geography and those details of that story. I have not been back. One of my brothers went a couple years ago. He's very involved with an organization called Toli that also does really great Holocaust education work. And he went, and he went to the sort of like the town hall, and he found the birth certificates for my grandmother and I believe her siblings. And he found a few other documents, which was fascinating. He found the oldest woman in the village. So he went with a translator. He found the oldest woman in a village who actually remembered Rybakova, who saved my grandparents. So that was really incredible. And the sugar factory is still there, and actually looks very similar to what it used to, based on what my grandmother said when she saw the photos. But there's the hope of going back. He wanted to go back to my grandmother's home. My grandmother gave the home to Rybakova's sons when she left Poland, but he was a little cautious. He didn't want to go unannounced in case they would think that in some way he was coming to sort of reclaim, which was not at all the intention. So there's a hope of going back, but I have not made it there yet.
Thank you. That's a great one. First of all, great job. You have a couple of people that share the same sentiment as myself. Jay Lipschitz in the chat saying beautiful presentation, and me personally, when you give that little bit about the person in the picture also being named Donna, it just gets me. So it's a great story. Couple questions we keep getting over in the Q&A relate to kind of your grandfather's story, and if you know that. So.
Yeah, so there's a story before the story for my grandfather. He actually was a soldier at the beginning of the war, and the part I know of his childhood is mainly about his sort of education and him learning to become a tailor. But at the start of the war, he was a Ukrainian soldier, and he was actually injured very, very early on. And when he was injured, he was basically left in a field. So there were, of course, many casualties in this one particular battle. And he remembers the story where I believe it was maybe Polish soldiers who came and said, who are you? Like, what nationality are you? And he said, Jewish. And so they left him in the fields, and there were some, nearby sort of villagers who brought like milk and a little bread that he kind of survived the night. And then the next day, when other people came back and again looked for, the survivors who, the wounded soldiers, he said that he was Ukrainian. And so they took him to a hospital. So he was actually in a hospital for about a year at the start of the war, recovering from some pretty severe shrapnel wounds. So he had a limp his entire life. And there's sort of a much longer story about how, it was actually the fact that he was in the hospital when he was trying to retrieve some items from someone who he had been in a bed near in the hospital. That's how he met my grandmother before the war. But it's a very long story, so I'll sort of keep that part short for now.
So the next question we have from Alana Snyder is your newborn the first of his or her generation? And what was it like for your grandmother to see a fourth generation survivor?
So he's not the first, he's the first for mine. But my brother in Israel has two children. And so, and my cousin also has two children. And so, I think for my grandmother, it's, I think it's the sort of thing that keeps her speechless. What I think too a lot is that my older brothers are actually twins, and when they were born, they were the first of the third generation. And I look at photos sometimes of my grandparents when they're holding my twin brothers, and can just only imagine what it must have been like to see that first third generation, and to have like two boys. There's just so much pride. And I think now for my grandmother, getting to see her great grandchildren, like they are, I think often that's sort of what keeps her going. They just bring so much light to her. And with my baby, we're waiting as soon as we can to be able to go to Israel, and in the meantime, we sort of FaceTime, and I'm often sort of reminding her, like, this is your great grandchild. And I think once she gets to meet him in person, that might really sink in.
Great. Have a couple of questions in the Q&A relating to kind of the process for how do you actually go into the schools to tell your story, and how many classrooms have you been able to tell your story to despite kind of COVID happening?
Yeah, so the way it works is that the WEDU team will sort of send out availability, basically. So they'll send it out to a list of all the people who've gone through the training, to offer up different dates, and sort of they'll also share where which borough the school is in, and so you'll pick a date, and sometimes there's a little bit of an exchange with the teacher beforehand. So the teacher might share, here's the book that they're reading, or just to give a little bit of context of how much the students understand so far. And then when going to the school, there's also the chance usually to talk to the teacher a little bit. So they'll kind of be able to give a little bit of the temperature of the class, which is helpful because I'll kind of slightly accommodate the story and maybe the level of detail, or the level of history that I share based on what kind of class I'm sharing it with. The teacher usually also kind of gives some cue as to, like, this is the kind of class that's going to have a lot of questions, or this that won't. So I'll know whether to shorten or lengthen the story accordingly. And then there's always time for questions at the end. And there's really a range. I mean, sometimes there are often questions about my grandfather and sort of this other character in the story that must have a lot of detail there as well. And there are, lighter questions like, what did they eat? Or how did they hide? Like there might be, questions like that, which sometimes are challenging. Like I don't always have the answers, and that's sort of the nature of telling not just telling someone else's story, but telling about someone else's trauma, is that there are gaps in that story. And it's like, at the same time that you want to kind of convey this so that it really sits with them, to help them understand why sometimes we don't always have the answers.
So there's a question from Elizabeth Sandy. Which DP camp was your grandma in?
I'm not sure.
Okay. And from Lynn Stein, how and when did your grandmother go to Israel?
So she went about, let's see, how many years ago would it be? Let's say around 15 years ago. So she was in her 80s when she went. And it's because after the war, my grandfather really wanted to go to Israel. That had been his dream. But my grandmother had an uncle who lived in New York, and that's what pulled them to come to New York, because it was a sort of clearer justification. They'd have like a landing pad. But it was always my grandfather's dream not to die and be buried in Israel, but to live in Israel. And so once my grandmother was in her 80s and my grandfather was 90 years old, they officially made Aliyah. And so my grandfather lived another 4 years. So he got to live in Israel, and my grandmother, of course, stayed there. And so they had a place that they would go to. They already had an apartment there, and so they would go sort of every year for Passover. So there was already like some familiarity, but yeah, she's been in that same place, and she's very well cared for there, and is very comfortable. She has this little window in her room, and she calls it the Riviera, which is really, she's very funny, my grandmother. But yeah, it's really impressive what age they were when they finally made Aliyah.
That's great. That's really incredible. We have one question that is asking about, said that I think there was 3 children who were hiding in the story, and did everyone survive, or do you know their story as well?
Yeah. Yeah, I will say yes. So there's some pieces of the story that I've still tried to kind of connect in terms of who was where when. There were times where my grandmother's brother Sam was with her in the same hiding place, and then there were times where he was hiding elsewhere, but he survived. And similarly, with my grandmother's younger brother Arnold, who also survived, he at one point, because he was younger, he couldn't kind of hide in the same way that they could, and so he had a very different story of basically being hidden, I think, in a, not an orphanage, like in a kind of like a church. Like he was faked being Christian, essentially. But there were also, I think, like a few different phases to his story about who exactly was hiding him. So there are pieces of it that, like, I've never fully understood where they were separated and where they were reconnected. But I do know that it was at the end of the war, when they all came back to my grandmother's village, that they were able to find each other. So they all survived. It was Velvel who was killed when he went back home, that was the one who didn't.
There's a question from Gabby Nyloff. Were your grandparents or great-grandparents part of the Hasidic community in their towns?
They weren't. Talking about level of observance, I feel like it's so difficult when kind of talking about a different generation. So for my, so they were all raised religious to a certain degree, but they weren't sort of ultra Orthodox Hasidic, like, of the time. They were in the slightly more secular, but they kept Shabbos. My grandmother still lights 3 Shabbos candles the way that her mother did. And would talk about how her older brother was able to continue with a Jewish education, but hers stopped earlier because she was a girl. So they were observant, but not from the sort of Hasidic community.
Got it. Another question we have here in the Q&A from Richard Robinson, which is, how much more detail is your grandma able to remember?
Really good question, because she remembers so much detail of particular instances, like the story of being separated from her sister. And then there are other stories or other sort of gaps that I've tried to fill that are a little harder to piece together. But she remembers a lot. You know, I know that there's a real range in terms of how much survivors will share of their experience. My grandfather he was just sort of a quieter, kind of more reticent person. He had nightmares his entire life. And so that's sort of where I saw his trauma. Like I grew up in Los Angeles, my grandparents were in New York, but I remember his nightmares from when I would visit. Whereas my grandmother would share her stories. I remember hearing those throughout my childhood. So there's a lot that she remembers. The Shoah Foundation did the recordings back in the 90s, which helped me a lot to gather a lot of details that I wouldn't hear so often in my grandparents' telling, but that the interview sort of revealed when the interviewer really dug in deeper.
So I have a question. How did you find out about 3GNY and about our WEDU program, and what, compelled you to join us and be a part of our great organization?
Yeah, so my mother has always been involved in 2G, and that sort of the living legacy of the Holocaust it's very much a part of my upbringing, and of course my family story, but also the way that I see the world. And I sort of regretted the fact, like I didn't know for a very long time that there was a 3G, that there was a sort of community around this, and kind of envied like this 2G that was very sort of tight knit, or really shared their stories. And at some point someone mentioned something in New York, like I heard that a 3G even existed, and so I just googled 3GNY, which is a very convenient acronym because it came up right away. And it was right before Yom HaShoah, and this was a few years ago, and I went to a Yom HaShoah event hosted by 3G, and I was like blown away. It was at the Sutton Place Synagogue. It was on the Lower East Side, beautiful event. And it was the first time ever that I was in a room of people my age who kind of shared this same story, family story. And so I heard them mention the WEDU program then, and I wanted to do it for an entire year before I was actually able to, because the classes sort of started on a rolling basis and I kind of couldn't make it happen, but I kept just wanting to do it. And so like every time there was a new session starting, I would try to figure out if I could. And then finally, after a year and a half, I was able to make it. So yeah, it was a long time coming.
Well, it's very funny because that is the exact event that I was at, and the very event that actually pushed me to join WEDU as well. So I guess that's why you and I both ended up in the same class. So that's pretty funny. We have a couple of questions here about generally kind of talking about your grandparents' experiences and kind of their orientations upon coming to the US right after the war.
When they came to the US, I mentioned my grandmother's uncle, and he lived on Ocean Parkway, and so they went there. And the story is that his wife was not too keen to have Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe staying in their home. And I've always found that so interesting because, I think our generation sort of looks to that as, like, if God forbid we heard of something happening, or Jews sort of suffering or escaping, anti-Semitism, like I feel like we would sort of, I've been raised with this idea of, welcoming with open arms. But I think at the time there was also there was a stigma around, these immigrants who were, who had survived the war. And so anyway, they went to the uncle's house, and the aunt, sort of not blood relation, sort of made it clear that she didn't really want them there. And the way my grandmother says it, she says they stayed there for a week and then they found their place in Coney Island. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it was really just a few days before they realized that they weren't going to stay there. And so, like I said, they lived in sort of like very humble accommodations in Coney Island, but my grandfather right away went to go look for work, and he used to tell this story of going to the fashion district, and he was a tailor, right? So he went to the garment district to try and find a job, and sort of knocked on the factory door, and they'd say like, well, what can you do? And he'd say everything. And they didn't really believe him, because like this was New York, you had these sort of like specializations. And so someone kind of gave him a little bit of advice, like, if you really want to get a job, you actually have to like tell them less than you do, because that way they'll believe you. So he went around, the next day, and they said, what do you do? And he said, I do collars, or I do sleeves, or whatever it was. And that's how he got a job. And then ultimately, my grandparents, they saved up to start their own coat factory. And so it was really, my grandfather doing that, and my grandmother with her 7th grade education, doing the books and managing payroll for, 50 employees, and negotiating with unions, and sort of doing that whole piece. But really just kind of building up as much as they could with what they had.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up for this evening. We've hit our time mark. Donna, thank you so much for speaking tonight and for sharing your grandmother's story. And Jonathan, thanks for being part of our program. Thank both of you for being part of WEDU and joining our group. And thanks again to all of you out there for joining us tonight. We're glad you took the time to hear Donna speak her family story, a story that we must never forget. Again, if you haven't made a donation to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. Again, if you go in the chat, there are ways you can donate down there very quickly. Thank you. Also, if you have any connections with educators, or if you want to get our 3G speakers into wherever you are, just let us know. We've got a large speakers bureau of grandchildren prepared, ready, willing, and able to speak whenever, wherever, just like you saw Donna do tonight. We hope to see you again soon. We have some great virtual events coming up, including another WEDU Wednesday on March 3rd, featuring my friend and yours, Alyssa Greengrass. On Thursday, March 25th, we have an event with 3G Dr. Jack Fried, author of Heirs of Auschwitz, A True Story of the Holocaust, Transforming Intergenerational Trauma and the Meaning of Existence. We'll be sending out an email tomorrow with the details of these events, as well as a recording of tonight's program. You could check out our past WEDU Wednesdays, all our speakers and all the other events on our 3GNY's YouTube channel. Thanks again for taking your time this evening to be with us. We're grateful as always for your support, and good night.